Imagine you're a child, you grow up in a Catholic school, it's burgeoning, it's joyful, etc. You graduate, you come back a few years later to be a teacher. And then over the course of the next 20 years, the school is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. It's got to be a blow to the heart as that happens. And then the diocese comes in and says, we're going to close the school. And the pastor says, Mary Pat, would you like to be principal so we can close the school with you? Not quite sure how that whole conversation went, but it went. And I know there was a lot of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament during that few months. And Mary Pat said yes. And she took that school. The diocese gave them 1 year. She formulated that school according to the true mission of the church, what the church wants for education, for Catholic schools. She turned it around. You can read about it in CNN and Washington Post. And, of course, the Catholic Liberal Education website, our case studies. It's all over. Then we were able to have the blessing of Mary Pat work for us for a couple of years until she got stolen away by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, where she now serves as the executive director of the Secretariat of Education. So I will step out and we will listen to Mary Pat. Thanks for joining us, Mary Pat.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. Boy, if only I were as good as Mike's introductions of me. But it is wonderful to be here with you all today. I found yesterday's introduction to be energizing and inspiring, and it's caused me to reflect on the gifts from my time and travel with ICLE. So many friends made, so many schools visited, such a first century experience of church. I was richly blessed. And when I have an opportunity to join with you, fellow workers in this vineyard, to talk about something for which we share a passion, that is Catholic liberal education, well, I'm not going to turn that down. And as others have said, I'm hopeful that next summer we'll find us together again, sipping some wine and enjoying great, lively conversation. Well, as Mike said, I've been in Catholic education a while. In fact, this is my 30th year, which is a horrible thought. I tell people I've been around so long that I remember when people still smoked in the faculty lounge and no one had to market their school. I've been a teacher, a vice principal, a consultant with ICLE, and now, as Mike mentioned, I am the director of the Secretariat of Catholic Education at USCCB. Spoiler alert, the best of them all was teaching. But my current position does give me something of a 30,000 feet view of American Catholic education. And it's from this perspective that I want to talk with you today. In these times of trouble and darkness, I would like to focus on the restoration of Catholic education so that it can indeed be a powerful vehicle for evangelization and, in turn, a light to this nation. These past few months have been fraught with crisis and uncertainty and no small amount of fear. So the chance for us to come together and lift our eyes to the richness and beauty of our own Catholic tradition of education is restorative for me, and I pray it will be for all of you. So once again, thank you for inviting me to take part. About 5 months ago, we began to hear the first reports of a virus that was sickening people and killing many all over the globe. Back then, in mid-February, many of you were probably focused on registering new students and keeping the ones you already have. My office was focused on drafting a Committee on Catholic Education statement on gender theory, much of what you just heard from Archbishop Miller would have found its way into that, it will eventually find its way into that document. And at the same time, my office was advocating for education freedom scholarships, a piece of legislation that would work to restore a parent's right to choose the appropriate educational setting for their children by encouraging states to develop and establish scholarship programs. By mid-March, I was home working at my dining room table, where you can find me today, and many of you were part of an amazing and valiant effort to transition from in-person education to a virtual learning experience. Truly, this was a shining moment for Catholic schools. You accomplished in a matter of days what took larger public school systems weeks, and in some cases, months to complete. And this was because in that moment, our Catholic schools drew upon our own inherent strengths and virtues, chiefly subsidiarity, or the principle of local governance. Pastors and principals know their communities. You knew what was needed, and you immediately began the work of acquiring it. You teachers jumped right in, made some modifications to curriculum and lessons, but did not need to wait for approval from some Leviathan system. In many cases, you stepped out in faith, and I think for a lot of people, it was a whole new experience having to teach online, to use technology every single day, and you made the adjustments as you went along. You gathered as a community for prayer and even virtual masses. The mission of Catholic education continued despite the considerable obstacles. The effects of the COVID crisis, however, remain a threat to many of our Catholic schools. The economic downturn has affected nearly every revenue stream for Catholic schools. The loss of employment to our families translates to reduced tuition revenue for our schools. The loss of weekly collections in our parishes means less parish subsidy is available for schools. And the loss of donations to diocesan funds signals a loss of tuition assistance at a time when nearly 10% of our principals report that the need for such assistance has or will increase in their school community. This is to say nothing of last spring's fundraisers. Many of your schools, I know, depend on a big spring fundraiser, and all of those had to be canceled or presented in a way that didn't give you as much benefit. So the COVID crisis has been destabilizing for our schools, and sadly, it will prove fatal for many. Roughly 10% of the principals of our approximately 5,000 elementary schools reported to my office that their school is under threat of closure at some point due to this crisis. Now, as of today, we believe that 138 Catholic schools have announced that they will not reopen for the 2021 academic year. Actually, make that 140. We just learned of 2 schools in Alaska. This fatality rate mirrors that of the virus in people. It disproportionately affects those with underlying conditions. And the past few decades have shown us that Catholic education has indeed suffered from underlying conditions. Back in 1960, when we were at the pinnacle of enrollment, there were 5,253,000 students in Catholic elementary and secondary schools. 40 years later, in 2000, that number would be 2,653,000, down by nearly 50%. We see this rate of decline accelerated, and today, 20 years after that, our enrollment stands at 1,737,000 students. Interestingly, our staffing rates haven't changed much over that time. In 1960, there were 152,000 full-time staff compared with 146,000 today, despite our enrollment being considerably less. Of course, some of you will remember 60-plus children in classrooms with only one religious teacher. Those conditions I don't think would ever fly today. The causes of these pre-existing conditions are probably many, ranging from an inadequate financial model to governance structures that fail to meet the needs of shifting communities. I've become aware in my position that one of the difficulties is that the areas of the country, for example, the Northeast, where we have the most infrastructure, we have many, many schools that were built by the immigrant community of a century ago, have a declining Catholic population, while in the Southwest, where we have an increasing population, we don't have the infrastructure, and the cost of building schools today is quite prohibitive. But despite all of that, my sense is that that's not quite the heart of the sickness that has afflicted our schools. I believe that our Catholic schools have been afflicted by the same disease that has plagued the church at large and has emptied her pews, and that is the crisis of the decline of faith. Now, you may recall that last summer, the Pew Research Institute published a survey that found that only 31% of Catholics professed a belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the doctrine of transubstantiation. This survey alarmed many of our bishops, and several offices at the conference were directed to begin to examine this phenomenon in light of our individual areas. So I began to pray and think about this through the lens of Catholic education. It was obvious that we had failed to hand on this most precious of church teachings, a part of the process of enculturation that Beth spoke about so eloquently yesterday. Yet I did not believe that it was primarily a catechetical issue. It seemed to me that most dioceses have strong catechetical standards. Teachers and catechists are often required to hold some type of certification, and most of the major Catholic religion textbook publishers have labored to improve Catholic identity and to be more in line with the general directory of catechesis that the bishops put out. Quite frankly, I think that most teachers and catechists are teaching the material they've been given, including the material on the Eucharist. On top of that, over the last decade or so, I have seen many Catholic schools make great strides in the practices of Catholic piety and devotion. It's now fairly common to hear of schools with weekly masses, opportunities for confession and adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, as well as the teaching of devotions such as the Rosary and the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. This is becoming the norm in diocesan schools, and that is a very good thing. But despite all this effort that Catholic schools and dioceses have undertaken to strengthen Catholic identity, it seems that the faith is still not sticking with our kids. And why might that be? Well, in my reflections, I came across this short parable from the Gospel of Luke, and I think the answer, at least partly, is contained in this. When a large crowd gathered, with people from one town after another journeying to him, he spoke in a parable. A sower went out to sow his seed. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path and was trampled, and the birds of the sky ate it up. Some seed fell on rocky ground, and when it grew, it withered for lack of moisture. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew with it and choked it. And some seed fell on good soil, and when it grew, it produced fruit 100-fold. After saying this, he called out, "Whoever has ears ought to hear." Now, in the parable, the sower is dutifully planting his seed. If he were in Catholic education, he probably even had new and improved seeds, seeds that were designed to meet the needs of diverse learners, seeds that were strong in Catholic identity, even a few seeds that were strong in STEM. And yet, it doesn't seem that they have taken root, and they certainly haven't borne much fruit. Now, it's interesting to me in thinking about this parable that the sower seemed a little oblivious to the soil condition. He hadn't stopped to think about its proper nourishment and cultivation. Heck, he hadn't even worked to clear out the thorns. He seemed to be a little frantic in his sowing, perhaps thinking that if he keeps doing what he's always done, something will take root sooner or later. But we know that his exercise in sowing will not be fruitful unless and until he considers how the seed is received, how well nourished and cultivated the soil should be. So what are we to take from this parable? In Catholic school terms, I think it means considering this. We place a child in religion class and tell her that through consecration, simple bread and wine undergo a unique and substantive change to become the very body and blood, soul and divinity of Christ. We expect her to accept and believe this supernatural reality, and when she's a small child, she happily complies. But then she leaves religion class and goes to science class, where maybe she reads a text authored by someone who believes that science alone answers life's biggest questions. Maybe that only that which can be observed and measured and quantified can be considered factual or true. From science class, she goes to language arts, where she is asked to evaluate statements as fact or opinion, such as the following, which was detailed in a New York Times piece a few years ago, written by a professor of philosophy who was alarmed at his daughter's homework assignment. Now, she had been given an assignment in a pretty typical reading publisher's workbook, and she was to evaluate a list of statements as fact or opinion. And the example that alarmed her father was this. The statement was, "You should not use foul language in school." Now, the teacher and presumably the teacher's guide marked this statement as opinion, despite the fact that it is based in a moral truth. It could not be considered fact based on a relativistic understanding of ethics. The subtle message is that facts equal truths, while opinions, even those based in moral principles, are not truths. So the parable of the sower invites us then to think about our curriculum and instruction, to think about presentations that may actually represent thorny or rocky soil. We must reconsider the very nature and essence and purpose of education. We need to reclaim it as a process of formation, of developing the capacities to see, to learn, and to understand. If it were simply about defining, teaching, and assessing standards, then we should have a well-educated populace working to maintain a civil order in which each person is encouraged to thrive in his or her chosen path of life. And yet a glance at the evening news tells us that this is not the case. In fact, modern secular education has not prepared our children to receive the truth in a way that abides and survives the storms of adolescence. My colleagues in the Office of Evangelization and Catechesis tell me that the average age of disaffiliation from the church is 13 and getting younger all the time. This startling fact indicates a systemic disorder in how we nurture and form and teach our children. This disorder, I believe, has been the result of decades of drift away from the church's understanding of education, of the human person for that matter, to an attempt to baptize secular methods, curricula, and standards. I believe that in this moment of COVID crisis, the Holy Spirit is waving a flag and calling us home. In the document, The Catholic School, promulgated by the Sacred Congregation for Catholic Education in 1977, the Holy See instructs us in the nature of a Catholic school by affirming this, quote, "The Catholic school is committed to the development of the whole person, since in Christ, the perfect man, all human values find their fulfillment and their fulfillment and unity. Herein lies the specifically Catholic character of the school." So to echo Archbishop Miller's wonderful talk before, it is in the incarnation of the Lord, the Word made flesh. That is what drives our commitment to educating the whole person. Now, educating the whole person is a buzzword you hear everywhere, and almost every model of school claims to do this. But we are the ones who have the why, the critical rationale for doing such a thing. And it means that we can only understand the nature of the human person in light of the incarnation and in accord with the church's understanding of the human person that Archbishop Miller outlined for us. That is, a human person made in the image of God, a union of body and soul, created in and for love, and destined for life eternal with God. So this, my friends, is really a call to recognize first that Jesus Christ is Logos, ordering principle of the universe, ordering principle of our schools. And all that we teach and all that we do must begin with him, and in him find their natural end. This, I believe, is the first step in the proper cultivation of the soil, the process of preparing our children to receive the truth and ultimately to love it. And truly, making this first step is really about just being willing to see it. Faith and vision are closely connected. Back when I started teaching in 1990 until, quite honestly, the early winter of 2010, I and many of my colleagues had labored under the idea that a Catholic school could be, even should be, academically excellent by embracing the models of secular education, or what we called the best practices. And incidentally, these were the only methods and practices that I knew, having graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in elementary education. I believe, though, that this adherence to best practices and what was good in the secular world needed to be complemented by a strong Catholic identity, and one that is rooted in liturgy, Catholic piety, and the passing on of devotion and practices. But this concept of Catholic education, where Catholic identity and academic excellence are often presented as these twin pillars, separate pillars, has not proven to be effective in tilling the soil. It has not properly nurtured in our children their God-given faculties for experiencing wonder and desiring truth. In fact, this model presents a harmful dualism, which springs from the truth that modern progressive education and the principles of our Catholic faith are ordered to very, very different ends. If, as Archbishop Miller proposed this morning, we are endeavoring to make saints, then it certainly stands that the means we use, the path we take, will be substantially different than those who are endeavoring for college and career readiness, however good those things may be in themselves, but they are lesser goods. They are lesser goods, and they are fulfilled, of course, when our higher goods are fulfilled. So I would submit that the very principles of Catholic liberal education, if they could be fully embraced and implemented in our schools, will form in the intellects and souls of our students those proper disposition for receiving the great truths of our faith and of our culture. And then we can begin the work of bringing light into the darkness of our culture today. Now, if you're like me and you grew up watching Letterman in high school and college, you may remember his top 10 list. So I came up with a top 10 list. I'm not counting down like he did. I'm not that creative, but I did come up with 10 kind of concepts, 10 precepts really, for how we can reclaim our academic program, our curriculum, so that it properly nurtures and nourishes our kids to receive the big truths. First is recognizing Christ as Logos, that all things cohere in him. This means we need to step away from the factory-style fragmentation of knowledge to a curriculum that is naturally integrated, especially in the humanities. And we need to begin this by recognizing that this integration is not something that we create for our students, but rather something that we reveal to them. Secondly, we teach history, both salvation history and Western civilization, and we do it in a comprehensive, coherent, and cohesive manner that acknowledges human failure and human triumph, always recognizes the action of the divine in the story of God and his people, and invites children to see themselves as part of the story. Third, we work to develop what is most human in our students. This is something that those of us at St. Jerome Academy heard frequently from our curriculum committee. And it was really, I think, probably the thing that most guided our pedagogy in the early days. What is most human in our students? Well, the ability to behold, to name, to choose, to wonder, to count, to classify, among many, many others. Fourth, we honor the natural development of the child by teaching, as Dorothy Sayers would have it, with the grain. In the early years when their minds are absorbent, we memorize and recite and narrate. Later, when their natural disposition turns to argument, we teach them the principles of discourse. Fifth, we proclaim that truth, goodness, and beauty form the soul, are worthy in their own right, and are meant for everyone. Sixth, our pedagogy mirrors the natural way in which people learn, with imitation preceding creation, and we foster the spirit of inquiry by valuing the question as much as the answer. Seventh, we reject what Stratford Caldecott called the excessively activist civilization that prioritizes doing over being. Instead, we work to restore being, which Caldecott called the secret of childhood. Eighth, we foster communion and community, echoing the gospel call to gather all nations in Christ. Thus, we are animated by a sense of compassionate service to all. This includes service to the poor in our communities, but also service to children who have learning difficulties, that we open our doors to so many of these children whose families often cannot find a Catholic education. Ninth, we recognize that parents are the primary educators of their children, and we seek to form a partnership that best serves the needs of children and families. This means that we invite families into the life of our schools. 10th, last but not least, we emphasize the formation of a moral and sacramental imagination. We do this by immersing our children in all kinds of literature, in scripture, in mythology, in verse, and poetry, all ordered to the reflection of beauty, truth, and goodness that will begin to help them to develop a supernatural vision. A child formed and educated in this way can receive the truth of the Eucharist, digest it with faith and reason, and be inspired to the lifelong conversion that Eucharistic faith demands. A child formed in this way will escape the despair of this faithless age because he will know who he is, a beloved child of the Father, and this will give him purpose in life. A child formed in this way will embrace and revere the dignity of the human person and reject all affronts to it, from violence to racism to abortion. A child formed in this way will be equipped with the tools of learning and thus will learn wisdom to judge rightly the things of this world and desire the things of heaven. Brought into relationship with Christ through sacrament, word, and in every aspect of their studies, they will speak hope to a darkened world that has forgotten where to look for the light. They will know, as the children in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia came to understand, that Aslan's instructions always work. There are no exceptions. So, my friends, we find ourselves in this moment when many of our schools are fighting for their very existence. And yet we find in our own tradition a source of strength and hope. Now, I have to say these last few months in my job, and I'm sure the next few, have really found me and everyone I'm working with quite engaged in the effort to keep our schools going. We're actually in the process of digesting a Senate bill that proposes to provide some aid to non-public schools. And I wholeheartedly believe that Catholic schools are worth saving. The tradition of Catholic education in America predates the founding of the nation by almost 170 years. From its earliest times, Catholic education has made a priority of service to the poor, whether in the mission schools of St. Augustine, Florida, where it served a mostly native population, or in the little White House in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where Elizabeth Seton and her sisters knocked on the doors of the mountain poor, offering to educate their children. We can look to the work of Mother Mary Lang and her Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, where they worked to evangelize the Black community through Catholic education. This manifestation of the preferential option for the poor continues today. As Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston relayed to President Trump in a recent call, Catholic schools as an institution have played a pivotal role in lifting many from poverty to a more prosperous life, especially in the immigrant community. I myself have been blessed to hear the inspiring stories of the recipients of the DC Opportunity Scholarship, the only federal voucher program in existence. Many of these children choose and attend our Catholic schools right here in the District of Columbia. But saving Catholic schools is not enough. We must work to restore them and to revive them, to reintroduce them to their own patrimony that has been lost over these many decades. So the Church's understanding of education, with its emphasis on the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, the mastery of language, and the connection of faith and reason, the development of moral imagination and a convincing anthropology. These will be the things that will restore our schools. Reimagined in this light of our tradition, our schools will be poised to fulfill St. John Paul II's description of them when he said this to American bishops during their ad limina visit to Rome. Quote, Catholic education aims not only to communicate facts, but also to transmit a coherent, comprehensive vision of life, in the conviction that the truths contained in that vision liberate students in the most profound meaning of human freedom. This movement, in which all of you are playing a part, provides a path forward to our schools. Your willingness to humbly submit to the rigors of learning a tradition that most of us did not encounter until adulthood. Your courage in standing against the modern conventions of education that point to standards and test scores as proof of learning. And most especially, it's your faith that compels you to invite Christ to be the Lord of your curriculum, your pedagogy, your extracurriculars, and your building itself. All of these things provide a beacon for all of American Catholic education. Light begins with a spark. When I first encountered Catholic liberal education with my school, St. Jerome Academy, in such dreadful shape, I feared that the spark would not survive the budget shortfall, the crumbling physical plan, and the skepticism of a community faced with major change. But you know, in reflection, I gotta tell you, it was my teachers, both the veterans and the newcomers, that brought their strong faith in Christ, their willingness to take this leap, and their loving support of me as their leader, that fanned that little spark into a steady flame. May the light that burns in all of your schools, in all of your hearts, illumine the way for our church, our Catholic schools, and our nation. Thank you. And I believe that we have, let's see, Mike's coming in to moderate. And here we go.
Okay, I think I'm back.
Great, yes,
All
you
right,
are.
thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. On the schedule, we have at 9:45 West Coast time, I should say 45 past the hour. It's currently 42 past the hour. At 45 past the hour, we have scheduled in a 15-minute break. So the next session will be breakouts. And you'll find those on the list in the Run the World app or on the computer. And there are 4 breakouts coming up. So choose which one you wanted to join and click into that. Maybe a minute or two before 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. Mountain, noon Central, 1 o'clock Eastern time. In light of that, you're welcome to take a quick break, get some coffee, or walk around a little bit. Mary Pat, if you're okay, I'll hold you here for about 7 more minutes, and we'll just ask a few questions if anybody has any. Okay, also a reminder that we do have all of these talks recorded, so you will have access to them again if you want to go back and take some extra notes.
And I'll share, somebody's asking about the 10 points. I'll share the text back with you guys at ICLE, and you can disseminate.
Okay, and Chris will put that up on the website for resources. Good. Any other questions out there? Mary Pat, Jack Grimes asks how you beautified the campus at St. Jerome's, and I know they're still doing it today. So
now they're actually really doing it today. Back when I was there, of course, we had no money, so any attempts to beautify the space really were done with volunteers, and it started small. We wanted to first kind of remove the typical teacher store stuff, the Garfield motivating posters, and give the kids something better to gaze on. This meant, honestly, me frantically going through the gift shop at the National Gallery of Art to find things in the beginning. Parents stepped forward. We actually raised money. A parent group raised money and gave me their sweat equity to start transforming schools for our Montessori space. So my point to this is, we had no money when we started. It was small things at first, but as the school has become more healthy, and Danny Flynn could tell you more about this, they have actually been able to do substantial and amazing beautification projects.
Very good. Thank you. When you walk in there today, the entryway shows the upstairs and the downstairs walls, and you have the Raphael's Disputation of the Eucharist and the School of Athens. It's very, very dramatic. Okay, Mary Pat, Rita asks how we work with the diocese that's pushing the public school methodologies of education.
Yeah, I think that's always going to be a challenge. Hopefully, I think the first level of defense is your pastor. If you can get your pastor on board with the fruitfulness of this in terms of evangelization, that's a good first step. Beyond that, I think what you really need to do is be, clever as a serpent, gentle as a dove. There are some things that you'll need to cooperate with. There were things I needed to cooperate with. And I know that Beth Sullivan does a great talk on standards. And I'll just say that standards, you can certainly participate and cooperate with diocesan standards, but you order them properly. You see them as not the end goal, not the thing to which teachers are teaching, but rather the basement. And I always think about, in building, when they tell you that something was done standard, it doesn't mean it was done all that well. So use the standards that way, have your teachers check back, but develop your curriculum based on teaching toward truth, goodness, and beauty.
Thank you. Very good. Somebody had mentioned that we should download the app. So anybody that's listening, if you download the app, you'll be able to now start connecting to people in the forums for other teachers from around the country in your grade level. Gavin Colvert, the new principal at Star of the Sea in San Francisco, asks what role adult formation plays in developing our schools.
I just gave a talk last week to a group of pastors about this very topic, and I said, fathers, you are certainly the shepherds of the parish and the school. And we think often of the children, but please shepherd the souls of these teachers just as well. And I think working with pastors to help you do that is really important. Some of you may know our pastor at St. Jerome's, when we transitioned, was Father Stack, and in typical Father Stack format, he said to me, Mary Pat, you better make sure those teachers have an interior life, because if not, they're going to get wiped out. And there's a truth in that. So I think working with pastors, spending time as principal too in allowing for faith sharing, for things like adoration. When we were able to have on-site faculty development at the school. We started each one of those with a Mass. We had Father come over to the school and celebrate Mass in a classroom with us. So it is critical, and I certainly urge you to work with your pastor on that.
Great, thank you. It relates to another question by Catherine about, I think it was Catherine, about how to orient the faculty most deeply and maybe most quickly, as many of our schools are just starting this renewal. Yeah. What are the suggestions you have for a well-ordered, deep, say efficient use of formation for the faculty?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My story is unique because I was under a timing gun. We had to move very, very quickly. And so what happened at St. Jerome's was we had a lot of formation front loaded. We had a week from our own curriculum committee. We had Mike and Jesse come from ICLE. Later, we had Andrew Kern and the Cersei Institute. All of this within about an 8-week time frame. If I didn't have to do it according to, a death sentence, then I think what I would recommend is considering a planning strategy so that you have a year of beginning to immerse in the principles. It's difficult for teachers because we're practical by nature. We immediately thinking, how do I do this with 8-year-olds? But slow everybody down. Recognize that steeping yourselves in the philosophy is really the most practical thing you can do, because all of your later decisions have to come from that. So I would say start with the big principles and then work with ICLE to begin a plan to train and form teachers.
Good. And as I mentioned earlier, Mary Pat, you and Father spent a lot of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament to start this.
Yeah, we did. We did.
Going back to Archbishop Miller's reference to St. John Paul II, faith and reason, those are the two wings. And I know with our faculty, with your faculty, many of them, they take a strong stance of prayer together. We do morning prayer together here as a faculty, retreats, prayer, Mass. Mm-hmm. Spiritually ground yourself, and sort of combined with that, do a faith formation of yourself. Start reading some of the great ideas. Then the other side, filling yourself with the philosophy of the education. And we have lots of resources for that on the Institute website. There's just a plethora of good things that most of us have never read, including many church documents. Catherine also says, did you ask for a prayer effort from parents and supporters? That's a good question.
Oh, absolutely. We certainly did. And there were occasions where our parent association actually scheduled, adoration time for parents to come in and pray specifically for the school. So that's critically important to involve your community as well.
Great. And then we're about out of time, so let me just ask this last question from Laura Leonard. She says, what are some ideas for serving students with learning difficulties while on a limited budget?
Yep. First thing I'll say about this, Laura, is I think this really goes to the very heart of what it means to be Christ in our teaching, to imitate Christ the teacher. And I think, my school had almost $1 million in debt at the time that we started this. And even with that, I did go to the pastor and I did tell him that we needed to have a resource teacher on staff. And that resource teacher is Eddie Beal. He's fabulous. And he and I talked about the gospel story of Zacchaeus, where Zacchaeus is too short to see the Lord, but needed a tree to climb so he could see Christ. And the impetus is that we must provide that tree. So one is if you make it a priority, number one. If you cannot do that, though, there are good methods that you can do. You can think about differentiating for different reading levels, keeping everyone on the same content. Work with your parents and staff also to provide some sort of breakout for smaller group instruction.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time, Mary Pat.
Of course.
God bless you.
Beautiful. Thank you.